Welcome to Enemies of the Mind, where we explore the hidden battles that shape our thoughts, our lives, and our faith. In each episode, we dive deep into the mental and spiritual challenges we all face, and how we can overcome them. Join us as we confront the unseen enemies of the mind and discover the power of renewal, peace, and victory in Christ. This podcast is made using Notebook LM, so the voices you will hear are artificially generated.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into some more juicy stuff on building mental resilience?
You bet. We're taking a deep dive today into a sermon series called Enemies of the Mind.
Sermons, huh? Now I know what you might be thinking. Sounds a little old school, right?
Yeah, not exactly your typical self-help stuff. But trust me on this one, these sermons are packed with really insightful and practical advice on overcoming those mental roadblocks we all face. You know, those enemies of the mind.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Enemies of the mind, huh? What kind of enemies are we talking about here?
Well, they cover a pretty wide range of challenges, everything from guilt and worry to anger and even addiction.
Addiction, huh? That's a heavy hitter. So how do these sermons approach something as complex as addiction?
That's what I think is so interesting. They don't shy away from the tough stuff. They dive right into those difficult topics and offer practical strategies for tackling them head on. It's not just about feeling better. It's about building genuine inner strength.
Okay, I'm hooked.
Yeah.
So how do they define these enemies of the mind? Where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, the sermons start by talking about the different ways we categorize mental illness. You know, the more familiar terms like anxiety, depression, and those more severe conditions that often benefit from professional help. But then they take it a step further.
Oh, how so?
They suggest that sin, regardless of your personal beliefs, can play a significant role in impacting our mental and emotional well-being. They argue that when we consistently act against our values, when we make choices that we know deep down are harmful to ourselves or others, it creates kind of inner turmoil.
So it's not about judging people for their beliefs, but rather acknowledging that our actions have consequences, even on our mental state. It's about taking responsibility for our choices.
Exactly. And that turmoil, that dissonance we feel when our actions don't align with our values, that's what they consider an enemy of the mind. It can manifest in different ways for different people. Stress, guilt, anxiety, those negative thought patterns that can really hold us back.
It's like that saying, we are our own worst enemies.
Precisely. And the good news is we have the power to change those patterns, to break free from those self-imposed limitations. And that's what we'll be exploring in this deep dive, how to identify those enemies, and most importantly, how to fight back and cultivate that unshakable inner resilience.
Sounds like a plan. So where do we start? What's the first enemy on the list?
Well, the first sermon kicks things off with a real attention grabber, guilt, the double-edged sword.
Guilt, huh? I don't know about you, but I don't usually think of guilt as a good thing. How could it be a double-edged sword?
That's exactly what I thought. But the sermons make a fascinating distinction between what they call worldly sorrow and godly grief. Worldly sorrow is that destructive, shame-based guilt that just eats away at you. It's that feeling of being caught, of beating yourself up over past mistakes without actually learning from them.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like getting stuck in a loop of regret and self-recrimination.
Exactly. But godly grief, as they describe it, is a more constructive kind of guilt. It's about acknowledging your wrongdoing, feeling that remorse, but then using that energy as fuel for positive change.
So it's not about denying guilt or suppressing it, but about channeling it in a healthier direction.
Exactly. And they use the story of Simon Peter denying Jesus as a prime example of this godly grief in action. Peter, in a moment of fear, publicly denies even knowing Jesus. But then what happens?
He's hit with a wave of guilt.
Whoa, absolutely. He's completely overwhelmed with remorse. But here's the thing, that remorse, it doesn't cripple him, it fuels him. It drives him to seek forgiveness, to recommit to his faith, and ultimately to become a leader in the early church.
So it's about transforming that guilt into action, into positive change.
Exactly. It's not about erasing guilt altogether, but about using it as a springboard for growth. And the sermons suggest that acknowledging our mistakes, taking responsibility, and then actively trying to make amends, that's a crucial step toward cultivating a sound mind.
Okay, so maybe guilt isn't always a bad thing? Interesting. But what about worry? How do they tackle that one?
Great question. The next sermon dives into materialism and worry, thieves of contentment. And it's a really relevant one, especially in today's world.
Okay, materialism and worry, now we're talking. Those are two things I'm well acquainted with. How do they connect those two?
Well, the sermons argue that this constant striving for more, for the next big thing, can actually rob us of our inner peace. It's like we're on this never-ending treadmill of wanting, and it's exhausting.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like that saying, keeping up with the Joneses. We're always comparing ourselves to others, wanting what they have, never feeling truly satisfied.
Exactly. It's a recipe for dissatisfaction and anxiety. And the sermons put it this way: materialism robs the mind of tranquility. We become so focused on what we lack, on what we think we need to be happy, that we miss out on the simple joys right in front of us.
It's so true. We get so caught up in chasing after things, a bigger house, a fancier car, the latest gadget, that we forget to appreciate what we already have. It's like
Yeah.
we're constantly looking ahead, never really stopping to enjoy the present moment.
And that's exactly what the sermons encourage us to do, to shift our focus from wanting to appreciating, to find contentment in the present moment rather than constantly striving for some future state of happiness. They argue that true contentment comes not from acquiring more, but from appreciating what we have and finding joy in the simple things.
It's like that old saying, happiness is a journey, not a destination. We spend so much time and energy chasing after happiness. But it's often those small, everyday moments of gratitude that bring us the most joy.
Exactly. And the sermons remind us that happiness is an inside job. It's not about our circumstances, it's about our mindset.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling the need for a mindset shift after that one. Materialism and worry, those are two enemies I'm ready to tackle head on. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, what's the next enemy on the list?
Well, the next sermon throws a bit of a curveball with the term double-mindedness.
Double-mindedness. That's not exactly a word you hear every day. What does that even mean?
Right. It's not your typical self-help jargon, but the sermons make a compelling case for why it's such a powerful enemy. They describe it as a divided will, that feeling of being torn between what you want and what you think you should do. It's that internal tug of war that can leave you feeling stuck, unfocused, and unable to make progress toward your goals.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely relate to that feeling of being pulled in multiple directions. It's like you're trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. You're not going to get very far like that.
Exactly. And the sermons suggest that this internal division can show up in a lot of sneaky ways: procrastination, lack of direction, imposter syndrome, that nagging feeling that you're not living up to your full potential. It's like you're constantly second-guessing yourself, unsure of which path to take.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like you're paralyzed by indecision, unable to fully commit to one direction or another. So how do we break free from this double-mindedness? How do we get ourselves unstuck?
That's where the sermons get really practical. They talk about the importance of clarifying your values, what truly matters to you, and then making choices that align with those values. It's about getting really clear on your priorities and then having the courage to say no to the things that distract you from your goals.
So it's about making conscious choices that support the life you want to create, even when it's tough.
Exactly. And that takes practice. It's a process of learning to tune out the noise, to silence those inner critics, and to trust your own inner compass. It's about moving from a place of fear and indecision to a place of clarity and conviction.
It's like finding that inner strength to finally make a decision and stick with it, even when doubts start creeping in.
Exactly. It's about building that muscle of commitment. But, sometimes even when we're clear on our values, we can get tripped up by another enemy, self-centeredness.
Oh boy, self-centeredness. That one's a real doozy. Everyone struggles with that to some degree, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in our own little worlds, our own needs and desires.
Especially in today's world, right? Social media, the constant pressure to achieve, to present this perfect image, it's almost like we're encouraged to be a little self-centered.
You're so right. It's like this breeding ground for comparison and self-doubt. We start measuring ourselves against everyone else's highlight reels and feeling like we're not measuring up.
And that's where the danger lies,
Yeah.
right? When that self-focus becomes all-consuming.
Exactly. The sermons emphasize that this isn't about self-care, which is important, of course. It's about the dangers of making ourselves the center of the universe. When we're constantly focused on our own needs, comparing ourselves to others, always seeking validation, it can really create this toxic inner environment.
And it can be so isolating too, right? When we're trapped in our own little bubbles of self-obsession, we miss out on the beauty of connection, of experiencing life through other people's perspectives.
Exactly. And the sermons drive this point home with the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one.
Refresh my memory.
So there's this Pharisee, a religious leader, very self-righteous, right? He goes to the temple to pray and stands there boasting about all his good deeds, how much better he is than everyone else.
Oh, I know the type.
Right. But then there's this tax collector, a despised figure in that culture, known for being dishonest. And he stands far off, humbly acknowledging his faults, asking for forgiveness.
So it's about humility versus pride.
Exactly. The sermons use this parable to illustrate the dangers of self-righteousness, of thinking we're better than others. True humility is about recognizing that we're all flawed, we all make mistakes, and we're all in need of grace.
It's a powerful reminder that none of us are perfect, and that's perfectly okay. But what about when those imperfections lead to conflict, when we're dealing with anger, resentment, bitterness? How do we handle those enemies?
That's where the next sermon comes in. Bitterness, the poison we brew.
Wow, that title alone is enough to make me want to steer clear.
It's intense, right? But it really captures the destructive nature of bitterness.
So how do they describe bitterness?
They describe it as this insidious enemy that can poison our thoughts, our relationships, our entire outlook on life.
It's like holding onto a grudge, letting that anger fester and grow until it consumes you.
Exactly. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
So how do we break free from that cycle of bitterness? What's the antidote?
The sermons are very clear on this one. Forgiveness.
Forgiveness. Easier said than done, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not easy, but it's essential for cultivating a sound mind.
Because holding on to that anger, it's like carrying a heavy weight around. It weighs us down, prevents us from moving forward.
Exactly. Forgiveness is about releasing that weight, freeing ourselves from the burden of the past. It's not about condoning what happened or pretending it didn't hurt, but about choosing to let go of the anger and resentment so we can heal and move on.
It's about reclaiming our power.
Yeah.
Choosing not to let those past hurts control our present or future.
Right. And the sermons offer a beautiful example of this with the story of Naomi and Ruth. Naomi, after experiencing a series of tragedies, is filled with bitterness and despair.
Understandably so.
Of course. But then, through the unwavering loyalty and love of her daughter-in-law, Ruth, she gradually begins to heal and find hope again. It's a powerful testament to the transformative power of love and forgiveness.
It's amazing how sometimes the greatest obstacle to forgiveness is ourselves, isn't it? We get so caught up in our own pain, our own sense of righteousness, that we forget that everyone makes mistakes. Everyone deserves a little grace, including ourselves.
So true. And that actually leads perfectly into the next sermon, which tackles the impossibility trap of perfectionism and legalism.
Oh, perfectionism. Now there's an enemy I know all too well. It's that constant pressure to do everything perfectly, to never make a mistake.
Which is, of course, impossible.
Exactly. Hence the impossibility trap. So how do they define perfectionism?
Well, the sermons make a really important distinction between striving for excellence, which can be a good thing, and demanding unattainable perfection, which is where we run into trouble.
Because we all want to do our best, right? But when does that desire for best cross the line into something unhealthy, something that holds us back?
That's the million-dollar question. And the sermons point out that this need for perfection is often rooted in fear.
Fear. Like what kind of fear?
Fear of failure, of course, but also fear of judgment, fear of not being good enough, fear of disappointing others.
And that fear can be paralyzing, right? I know I've definitely put things off because I was so afraid of not doing them perfectly.
Exactly. And that's the impossibility trap in a nutshell. We set these unrealistic standards for ourselves, and then we end up procrastinating, second-guessing ourselves, and ultimately holding ourselves back from achieving our full potential.
It's like we're so afraid of failing that we end up failing before we even start.
Precisely. So how do we escape this trap? The sermons emphasize the importance of self-compassion.
Self-compassion, that sounds like the opposite of beating ourselves up for not being perfect.
Exactly. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a close friend.
So instead of focusing on our flaws and mistakes, we focus on our strengths and accomplishment.
Exactly. It's about celebrating our progress, no matter how small, and giving ourselves permission to make mistakes along the way.
Because let's be honest, we all make mistakes. It's part of being human. It's how we learn and grow.
Exactly. And the sermons remind us that we don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love and acceptance from ourselves or others.
That's such an important message. But okay, let's say we've embraced self-compassion. We're working on silencing those inner critics. What else can we do to overcome this perfectionism trap?
Well, the sermons also talk about the importance of setting realistic expectations. It's about breaking down large tasks into smaller, more manageable steps and focusing on making progress one step at a time.
Instead of getting overwhelmed by the big picture, we focus on the small steps we can take each day to move closer to our goals.
Exactly, and that can make a huge difference. They also emphasize the importance of focusing on the present moment.
Being present, mindful, in the here and now.
Exactly. It's about letting go of the need to control everything, to constantly replay past mistakes or worry about future outcomes. It's about being fully present in this moment, appreciating the good, and approaching challenges with a calm and centered mind.
It's like quieting that mental chatter that keeps us stuck in the past or worrying about the future.
Exactly. And the sermons offer a powerful quote from the Bible to illustrate this. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own.
I love that. It's a great reminder that we can't control everything, and that worrying about things outside of our control is a recipe for stress and anxiety.
Right. And speaking of finding balance, the next sermon dives into that very topic. Avoiding extremes, finding balance.
Okay, finding balance, that sounds like something we could all use a little more of in our lives. So what kind of extremes are we talking about here?
It's about recognizing that rigidity, that all-or-nothing thinking can really be a form of self-sabotage. The sermons encourage us to find a middle ground, to embrace flexibility and grace, both in how we treat ourselves and others.
So it's not about striving for perfection, but about finding a healthy balance between pushing ourselves to grow and being gentle with ourselves when we fall short.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that life is full of nuances, and we can't always categorize things as black or white, good or bad. There's often a lot of gray area in between.
And that recognizing that gray area can be incredibly freeing, can it?
Absolutely. When we can let go of rigid thinking and embrace a more balanced perspective, it reduces stress, fosters creativity, and allows us to approach challenges with a more open mind.
It's like finding that sweet spot between discipline and flexibility, structure and spontaneity.
Exactly. And the sermons highlight the importance of finding joy and contentment in both the highs and lows of life. They quote a passage from Ecclesiastes that I find really helpful. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven.
It's a beautiful reminder that life is a journey with its share of peaks and valleys, and that learning to navigate both with grace and resilience is essential for cultivating a sound mind.
Well said. And speaking of challenges, the next sermon tackles one that I think a lot of us struggle with: anger, the city under siege.
Wow, that's quite an image. What's the message behind that title?
It really highlights the destructive nature of unchecked anger. The sermons compare anger to a powerful force that, when left unmanaged, can wreak havoc in our lives, much like a city under siege.
Okay, that's a powerful analogy.
Hmm.
So how do we keep those city walls from crumbling? How do we handle anger in a healthy way?
Well, the sermons make an important point right off the bat. Anger isn't inherently bad. It's a natural human emotion, and it can actually be a powerful force for good when channeled appropriately.
So it's not about suppressing anger altogether, but about learning to manage it effectively.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the triggers that set us off, understanding the root cause of our anger, and finding healthy ways to express it.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging and expressing our anger in a healthy way, without letting it control us.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful tools the sermons offer for managing anger is, you guessed it, forgiveness.
Forgiveness, there it is again. It seems like forgiveness is a recurring theme in these sermons.
It really is. And for good reason. It's a powerful force for healing and transformation.
So how do they tie forgiveness into anger?
Well, they point out that holding on to anger and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It just doesn't work that way.
It's us who ends up suffering the most.
Right, exactly. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about freeing ourselves from that burden of anger and resentment.
It's about choosing to see the situation differently, choosing to let go of the pain, and choosing to move forward.
Precisely. And the sermons illustrate this beautifully with the parable of the unforgiving servant.
Ah, the parables. Always loved a good parable. What's this one about?
So there's this servant who owes a massive debt to his master, like an impossible amount to repay.
Okay, I'm already feeling for this guy.
Right. But the master, he's feeling merciful that day and forgives the entire debt.
Wow. Talk about a lucky break.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting. This same servant goes out and finds another servant who owes him a much smaller amount.
Oh, no. Don't tell me.
Yep, he demands repayment and has the other servant thrown in jail when he can't pay.
Oh, man. That's cold. What happens next? I'm guessing the master doesn't take too kindly to that.
You got it. The master finds out and is furious. He throws the unforgiving servant in jail, reminding him that he should have shown the same mercy he was given.
That's a powerful reminder that we all fall short, we all make mistakes, and we all need a little grace sometimes.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a reminder that the measure we use to judge others is often the measure that will be used to judge us.
It's about extending that same compassion and understanding to others that we hope to receive ourselves.
Exactly. And that's a great segue into the next enemy. The sermons tackle addiction.
Addiction. That's a heavy one. How do they even begin to address something as complex as addiction in a sermon series?
That's what I thought was so interesting. They don't shy away from it. They call it like it is addictions, the enslaved spirit.
Wow, the enslaved spirit. That's powerful. It really conveys that feeling of being trapped, controlled by something outside of yourself.
Right. And they're not just talking about the obvious addictions like drugs or alcohol.
Oh, what else is on their list?
They talk about gambling, pornography, excessive media consumption. They even mention workaholism.
Workaholism. Wow, I never thought of that as an addiction, but I can see how it fits the pattern. It's that same kind of compulsive behavior, that feeling of being unable to stop, even when you know it's harming you.
Exactly. And the sermons really emphasize that at its core, addiction is about being enslaved to our desires. It's about that loss of control, that feeling of being powerless to resist those cravings, even when we know they're harmful.
So how do we break free from those chains? What's their advice for overcoming addiction?
Well, the sermons offer a message of hope. They emphasize the importance of confession, admitting that we have a problem and seeking help from others. They talk about the power of accountability, of surrounding ourselves with people who support our recovery and hold us accountable for our actions.
It's that idea that we don't have to fight our battles alone, right?
Yeah.
There's strength in vulnerability, in reaching out for support.
Exactly. They also emphasize the importance of replacing those addictive behaviors with healthier alternatives.
So instead of reaching for that extra glass of wine after a stressful day, maybe go for a run, connect with a friend, or pick up a new hobby, something that brings joy and fulfillment without the harmful consequences.
Exactly. It's about finding healthier coping mechanisms, activities that nourish our mind, body, and spirit.
Makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Guilt, worry, self-centeredness, bitterness, perfectionism, anger, addiction. Phew. It's exhausting just thinking about all these enemies we're battling on a daily basis.
I know, right? It's a lot. But remember, the whole point of identifying these enemies is to learn how to overcome them. And these sermons offer a powerful toolkit for doing just that.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect or avoiding these challenges altogether. It's about developing the inner strength and resilience to navigate life's ups and downs with grace and wisdom.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And speaking of wisdom, that brings us to our final sermon, Divine Peace, Guardian of the Heart and Mind.
Divine peace. That sounds lovely. Sign me up. But I have to admit, this one sounds a little, well, religious, even for me.
I hear you. But just like with all the other sermons, there are some really valuable takeaways here, even if you don't subscribe to the theological perspective.
Okay, I'm all ears. So how do they define divine peace?
Well, they describe it as a state of inner tranquility, a sense of calmness and serenity that transcends our circumstances.
Okay, that sounds pretty good to me. Especially in today's world, right? We're constantly bombarded with information stimulation, pressure. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and anxious. So how do we cultivate this inner peace? What's their secret?
Well, one of the key practices they emphasize is gratitude.
Gratitude, that's a big one. We've all heard it a million times. Count your blessings, focus on the positive. But it's amazing how often we forget to do it.
Right. It's so easy to get caught up in the negative, what's wrong, what's missing, what we don't have. But the sermons remind us that gratitude is a choice. We can choose to focus on what we're grateful for, even in the midst of difficulties.
And that simple shift in perspective can make a world of difference. It's like that old saying, change your thoughts, change your life.
Exactly. They also talk about the importance of connecting with something larger than ourselves.
What does that mean exactly?
It could be faith, nature, art, music, anything that helps us tap into a sense of awe and wonder that reminds us that we're part of something much bigger than our own little problems and worries.
It's about finding that sense of perspective, right? Remembering that there's a whole universe out there beyond our own little bubbles.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of choosing our focus. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to focus on the positive, to look for the good, even in difficult situations.
It's about training our minds to focus on what we can control: our thoughts, our reactions, our choices, rather than getting bogged down by the things we can't.
Exactly. And that takes practice. But the more we do it, the easier it becomes to find that sense of peace, even in the midst of chaos.
That's a really powerful message. And it leads perfectly into the final sermon of this series: Suffering Forged, the Fortified Spirit.
This one is definitely a thought provoker.
Suffering Forged. That sounds intense. It's not exactly a message you hear every day, that suffering can make us stronger.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive, right? But the sermons make a compelling case for how suffering, while undeniably painful, can also be a catalyst for growth and resilience.
So it's about finding meaning in the midst of pain, learning from our struggles, and using those experiences to become stronger and wiser.
Exactly. And they acknowledge that this is not an easy process. It's messy, it's painful, and it takes time.
So how do we navigate that process? What advice do they offer for those who are going through difficult times?
Well, they encourage us to shift our perspective on suffering. Instead of seeing it as something to be avoided at all costs, they suggest we view it as an inevitable part of the human experience, an opportunity for growth and transformation.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
But sometimes it sure feels like it's trying to kill us.
Oh, absolutely. It's not about pretending that suffering is easy or enjoyable, but about recognizing that it has the potential to shape us in profound ways.
To refine us, to test our limits, to help us discover our own inner strength and resilience.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of not suffering alone. They talk about the power of reaching out for support, of connecting with others who understand what we're going through.
Because we all need a little help sometimes,
Yeah.
right? It's okay to not be okay.
Exactly. It's okay to ask for help, to lean on others when we need it. There's strength and vulnerability in admitting that we don't have all the answers.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. From guilt and worry to addiction and suffering, we've explored a whole range of enemies of the mind, and most importantly, uncovered practical strategies for combating them.
It's been quite a journey, and I think what I find most remarkable is that even though these teachings come from a religious context, they offer so much valuable wisdom that transcends any particular belief system.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner strength, that resilience, that wisdom to navigate the challenges of life, no matter what life throws our way.
Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the enemies of the mind, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will carry with them?
You know, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we all have the power within us to cultivate a sound mind. It's not about being perfect or avoiding hardship altogether. It's about developing those inner resources, the resilience, the self-awareness, the compassion to face those challenges with courage and wisdom.
Beautifully said.
Mhm.
And if you had to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder, what would it be?
I would ask them this: what is one enemy of the mind you're ready to confront? And what's one small step you can take today to start building your defenses?
I love that. It's a call to action, an invitation to take all this knowledge and put it into practice. Because knowledge without action is just, well, it's just information. It's only when we apply these insights to our lives that we start to experience real change.
Couldn't agree more. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into this fascinating world of the human mind.
That's it for this deep dive into the enemies of the mind. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those minds sharp.